The vast sun-baked desert of Albuquerque's West Mesa became the unwilling stage for one of New Mexico's most disturbing mysteries. In February 2009, a chance discovery unearthed a horrific secret buried beneath the desert soil: the skeletal remains of 11 women and an unborn child. This disturbing finding marked the beginning of the largest homicide investigation in the history of the Albuquerque Police Department, a case that would grip the city in terror. Called Albuquerque's crime of the century, the case quickly gained notoriety, not only for the sheer number of victims, but also the agonizingly slow pace of the investigation, and the fact that it remains unsolved over 15 years later. The unknown perpetrator or perpetrators responsible for these heinous crimes became known by the moniker of the West Mesa Bone Collector. Let's get spooky. Hey spooky people, it's your best friend Kenny here, and before we get to the video, let's make sure that you are subscribed to this channel, The Spooky Lawyer. Please like and share this video. Share this video with your lawn guy. It's spring, your lawn guy is out there probably putting in some work to clean up all the crap that's been in your yard, and he probably needs something to kick off his shoes and unwind to, so give him a good spooky story video for him. Thanks. I appreciate it. On the morning of February 2nd, 2009, Christine Ross was walking her dog, Ruka, in her West Mesa subdivision community. As they walked a trail near developing housing tracts, Ruka caught a scent and began digging, soon unearthing a large bone. So she took a photograph and texted it to her sister, a nurse. Her sister said that it resembled a human femur, prompting Ross to immediately notify the Albuquerque Police Department. The responding officers quickly confirmed the grim reality. The bone was indeed human. The chance discovery, made years after the last victim likely disappeared, became a catalyst for uncovering a tragedy hidden in plain sight. The location, near the intersection of 118th Street and the Dennis Chavez Boulevard, bordered areas undergoing suburban development. And the timing was significant. The 2008 housing market collapse had stalled development in the area. Prior to construction activities, including the building of a retaining wall to address flooding complaints from nearby residents, inadvertently disturbed the burial site, ultimately exposing the bone that Ruka found. Imagine your dog discovering a massive grave site from a serial killer. That's wild. The burial site during the period of the murders, which was estimated between 2001 and 2005, was largely undeveloped desert. By 2006, housing developments had begun to encroach on the area, but hadn't yet reached a specific burial ground. Satellite imagery captured between 2003 and 2005 revealed tire tracks and patches of disturbed soil in the vicinity, suggesting repeat visits and activity consistent with burials, with the last likely occurring in 2005. The area is desolate, characterized by dry sand, tumbleweeds, and located near other isolated facilities like a municipal shooting range and the county detention center. Christine Ross's initial report triggered an intensive investigation and excavation effort that unfolded over the ensuing weeks and months. Detectives and forensic teams meticulously combed the area, eventually uncovering the skeletal remains of 11 women and one unborn fetus. The remains were found in shallow, makeshift graves. The sheer scale of the discovery was staggering. The bodies were scattered across a wide area, initially estimated at least 100 acres, making it the largest crime scene in Albuquerque's history. The excavation process itself was challenging. The shallow burials meant the remains were vulnerable to environmental factors and disturbances. Also, construction equipment used in the area prior to the discovery had disturbed the graves, splintering bones, and commingling remains, further complicating the recovery and analysis. The process required painstaking care, with investigators employing archaeological techniques and carefully sifting through vast amounts of soil to ensure all evidence was collected. The delay between the timing of the murders, between 2001 and 2005, and the discovery of the remains in 2009, presented a difficult forensic obstacle. Years of burial in the harsh desert environment meant the bodies were heavily decomposed, consisting primarily of skeletal remains. The extreme temperatures, fluctuating moisture levels, soil composition, and microbial activity inherent in such an environment severely degrade biological evidence, particularly soft tissues needed to determine the exact cause of death and fragile DNA molecules that could link a perpetrator to the crime. This degradation made it impossible for medical examiners to definitively state how the women were killed. although strangulation was suspected due to the lack of evidence for shooting or blunt force trauma. It also drastically reduced the likelihood of recovering viable DNA from the perpetrators at the burial site. The disturbance caused by the construction activity made it even more difficult by further compromising the integrity of the individual burial sites. The delayed discovery, environmental degradation, and scene disturbance created the primary hurdles that have hindered a definitive forensic resolution to the case. Identifying the 11 women and the unborn child found buried on the West Mesa was a slow and meticulous process. It took nearly a year to complete. Due to the advanced state of decomposition, investigators relied heavily on forensic science. Experts utilized dental records where available and conducted DNA analysis, comparing samples from the remains to genetic material provided by families of missing persons. The University of North Texas Center for Human Identification played a role in the process, successfully identifying victims like Virginia Cloven and Evelyn Salazar through DNA in November 2009. The final victim, 15-year-old Jamie Barella, was identified in January 2010. The 11 women who were victims came from diverse backgrounds, but many shared common struggles. Their stories were pieced together from official reports and family accounts, and they paint a picture of individuals loved and missed, whose vulnerabilities were tragically exploited. A stark pattern emerged among the victims. 10 of the 11 women, Monica Candelaria, Victoria Chavez, Virginia Cloven, Selenia Edwards, Cinnamon Elks, Doreen Marquez, Julie Nieto, Veronica Romero, Evelyn Salazar, and Michelle Valdez had documented ties to both drug use and prostitution. Most were young Hispanic women with ages ranging from 15 to 32. These shared circumstances pointed towards a specific vulnerability that the perpetrators likely exploited. There were some exceptions. 15-year-old Jamie Barella had no known involvement in drug use or prostitution, making her disappearance alongside her cousin Evelyn Salazar particularly puzzling. Selenia Edwards, also 15, stood out as the only African-American victim, and the only one confirmed to be from out of state, having run away from Lawton, Oklahoma. Michelle Valdez was 4 months pregnant at the time of her murder, adding another layer to the tragedy with the discovery of her unborn child's remains buried alongside hers. Despite the difficult circumstances many faced, family members consistently emphasized that these women were more than their struggles. They were loved daughters, mothers, cousins, and friends. Dan Valdez, Michelle's father, spoke of how her smile could light up a room. Mary Gutierrez remembered her daughter Victoria Chavez as outgoing and fun-loving, enjoying hiking and camping. Doreen Marquez's young daughter Destiny recalled her mother's beauty. Mira Salazar, who was the mother of Evelyn Salazar, stressed they didn't deserve what they got. They all had families that care for them. These poignant reflections underscore the profound human loss behind the statistics and challenging narrative that might otherwise diminish the victims due to their association with marginalized activities. The tragedy of the West Mesa killings is potentially amplified by the existence of other missing women with similar backgrounds who vanished during the same period. Detective Ida Lopez had compiled a list of such women before the 2009 discovery, recognizing a disturbing pattern. While 10 women from her list were tragically accounted for among the 11 victims found, several others from the initial list, and additional women identified later, remain missing. As of 2024, Albuquerque Police Department acknowledges that 8 women still missing whom investigators believe could be connected to the case. Martha Lucher, Anna Vigil, Felipe Gonzalez, Nina Heron, Jillian Ortiz Henderson, Chantel Waits, Leah Peebles, and Vanessa Reed. Darlene Marie Trujillo is also sometimes included in this list from women missing from that era. This persistent uncertainty surrounding these missing individuals raises the haunting possibility that the true scope of the West Mesa Bone Collector's activities may extend beyond the 11 known victims, potentially involving other undiscovered burial sites and further complicating an already challenging investigation. Following the discovery of the first human bone on February 2, 2009, the Albuquerque Police Department launched what would become the largest homicide investigation in its history. Recognizing the potential scale and complexity, a task force, known as the 118th Street Task Force, was formed specifically to handle the case. This task force became the central point for coordinating investigative efforts and managing the influx of information. The FBI became involved early in the investigation, providing support and resources. The FBI conducted crime analyses, both in the initial stages and again in 2013, offering investigative suggestions that the Albuquerque Police Department reportedly followed up on. The federal agency also contributed significantly to the substantial reward offered for information leading to an arrest and prosecution, demonstrating a sustained federal commitment to resolving the case. Within the Albuquerque Police Department, Detective Ida Lopez emerged as a pivotal figure, her involvement predating the horrific discovery on the Mesa. Years before 2009, Detective Lopez had begun compiling a list of a pattern of women, many with known ties to drugs and prostitution, who were disappearing from Albuquerque streets between 2001 and 2006. Her early recognition of this pattern proved crucial, yet it also highlighted potential shortcomings in the initial institutional response. Some accounts suggest Lopez pursued these cases at a time when Albuquerque Police Department leadership may not have prioritized investigations involving women engaged in high-risk lifestyles. Despite these early challenges, Detective Lopez remained deeply involved in the West Mesa investigation for years after the discovery, becoming a consistent point of contact for the case and frequently speaking publicly about the ongoing efforts and the need for information. Her persistence and early awareness stand in stark contrast to the family's expressed frustrations about the perceived lack of urgency in the initial missing persons investigations. This disparity suggests a potential gap between the concerns of individual officers like Lopez and the broader department resource allocation and prioritization, particularly when dealing with marginalized victims, which ultimately allowed the situation to escalate undetected until the chance discovery in 2009 forced a response. The 118th Street Task Force employs a range of investigative techniques in its protracted effort to solve the murders. As I discussed earlier, the initial phase involved the meticulous excavation of the vast crime scene using archaeological methods. Forensic analysis, primarily DNA and dental records, were essential for identifying the victims. Investigators stated they continued to retest evidence as forensic technology, such as DNA analysis capabilities, advanced over the years. A dedicated tip line was established, generating a massive volume of information. By February 2024, over 1,400 tips had been submitted. These tips were continuously documented, vetted, and entered into a database. At one point, the task force conducted a comprehensive audit of all received tips to ensure each lead was thoroughly pursued. Investigators interviewed approximately 200 women known to have arrest records for drugs and prostitution, seeking potential connections and information. They also publicly appealed for information from anyone who might have worked the streets between 2001 and 2005 or solicited the victims during that time frame. Beyond the initial excavation, APD conducted at least 7 additional land searches in the years following the discovery, often prompted by specific tips. Notable searches occurred in 2018, one utilizing a ground-penetrating radar technology based on a tip regarding the potentially connected missing women, and another near the original site which uncovered an unrelated ancient Native American burial ground. GPR is a geophysical technique used to non-destructively detect subsurface anomalies, potentially including buried remains. Another extensive search based on a tip was conducted in 2021, but yielded no relevant findings. In a significant public appeal, APD released 6 photographs depicting 7 unidentified women, stating they may be linked to the case. The origin of these photos, some showing women who appeared unconscious, was never officially disclosed, though they were later linked to a camera belonging to a person of interest named Lorenzo Montoya. This move generated leads, but proved ultimately complex. 2 women were identified as alive, and another was found to have died of natural causes unrelated to the case. Considerable resources were dedicated to conducting background investigations on potential suspects identified through tips or other means. The investigation faced formidable challenges from its inception. The most significant hurdle was the multi-year gap, ranging from 4 to 8 years, between the women's disappearances and the murders, and the discovery of their remains. The case was effectively cold the moment it began, severely limiting the availability and quality of evidence. As I previously discussed, the discovery yielded primarily skeletal remains. The lack of soft tissue made determining the precise cause of death extremely difficult, hindering efforts to understand the killer's methods. Furthermore, the harsh desert environment and years of exposure likely degraded any potential perpetrator DNA beyond the limits of recovery, even with advancing technology. The fact that 10 of the 11 victims had ties to prostitution and drug use likely influenced the initial police and public response to their disappearances. Families expressed anguish, believing their initial missing person reports filed years earlier were not treated with sufficient urgency. This delay in recognizing a potential pattern or threat contributed directly to the case becoming cold before it was ever officially opened. While APD Missing Persons Unit's standing operating procedures exist from later years, the investigation has been hampered by a complete absence of known witnesses to the abductions, murders, or burials. The vast, undeveloped nature of the West Mesa raised concerns about the possibility of other, undiscovered burial sites, adding another layer of complexity. Over the lengthy investigation, several individuals emerged as potential persons of interest, attracting significant police attention. However, despite extensive investigation, no one has ever been officially charged in connection with the West Mesa murders. Lorenzo Montoya, who was a pressman at a local printing company, became a primary focus for investigators. Several factors pointed towards him. Montoya lived in a trailer park less than 3 miles away from the burial site. In 2006, dirt trails reportedly connected the trailer park directly to the remote area where the bodies were later found. Police also discovered tire tracks leading from the burial site towards a street near Montoya's home. Montoya had a documented history of violence, specifically targeting sex workers, including 2 prior arrests for violent attacks. He had also reportedly threatened to kill a girlfriend and bury her in lime. Former co-workers told police that Montoya had explicitly talked about killing women and burying their bodies on the West Mesa. He also had frequent encounters with law enforcement for soliciting sex workers. In December 2006, Montoya strangled 19-year-old Sharika Hill to death inside his trailer. Ms. Hill was a sex worker he had met online. Hill had been tied up with duct tape and electrical cords. As Montoya attempted to move Hill's body into his car trunk, he was confronted and fatally shot by Hill's boyfriend, Frederick Williams. Law enforcement officials at the time commented that the brutality of the Hill murder suggested it was likely not Montoya's first killing. The disappearances linked to the West Mesa case appeared to cease after Montoya's death in December 2006. A search of Montoya's home uncovered a homemade video recording. Police released only a portion, but described the initial part as showing Montoya having sex with an unidentified woman who appeared to be possibly deceased. After fading to black, sounds could reportedly be heard resembling Montoya tearing duct tape from a roll and opening a garbage bag, actions consistent with preparing a body for disposal. The photographs that were released publicly in 2010 were taken from this video evidence. Despite this significant evidence, Montoya was never definitively linked forensically to the West Mesa victims or the burial site itself, and police remained cautious about officially naming him the killer. His death in 2006 presents a major investigative impasse. While considered the best suspect by former police chief Michael Geyer, Montoya cannot be interrogated, confess, or stand trial. Without a direct forensic link, such as DNA recovered from the burial site matching Montoya, proving his responsibility for the West Mesa murders beyond a reasonable doubt is virtually impossible. This leaves the case perpetually unresolved regarding arguably the most likely suspect, hindering closure for the victims' families and potentially obscuring the involvement of others. The APD's later legislative efforts to allow DNA entry into databases for deceased suspects might reflect the frustrations encountered in cases like Montoya's. Other than Montoya, there are other persons of interest in this case. Joseph Bley. Joseph Bley worked in landscaping and became another person of interest, particularly after 2014. Bley had a disturbing history of sexual violence, earning the moniker the mid-school rapist for a series of attacks on young teenage girls near McKinley Middle School in the 1980s. He was eventually convicted in 2015 on multiple counts of rape involving 4 victims and sentenced to 90 years in prison. His DNA was also linked to the 2015 killing of a sex worker found dead on Central Avenue, a street notorious for sex work and frequented by some West Mesa victims. Investigators had observed Bley cruising this area and picking up sex work. A key piece of potential evidence was a plant tag, identified as being from a spearmint juniper found near the buried remains of Virginia Cloven. The tag was traced back to a nursery in California that supplied plants to Albuquerque nurseries, including one Bley was known to frequent due to his landscaping work. A search of Bley's home uncovered women's jewelry and underwear that did not belong to his wife or daughter. Furthermore, a cellmate alleged that Bley admitted to hiring the West Mesa victims, referring to them dismissively as trashy. However, the evidence against Bley remains circumstantial. Investigators meticulously checked thousands of nursery receipts but could not establish a direct link between Bley and the specific plant tag found at the burial site. Bley has never been charged in the West Mesa murders and has denied any involvement. The ambiguity surrounding evidence like the plant tag associated with Bley or the video found in Montoya's possession highlights the central challenge in this case. While these pieces of evidence are highly suspicious and suggestive, they lack the definitive quality needed to meet the high burden of proof required for criminal charges, especially in a case with no witnesses and degraded primary evidence. Another person of interest is Ron Irwin. In August 2010, the investigation briefly focused on Ron Irwin, a photographer and businessman from Joplin, Missouri. Irwin was known to travel frequently to Albuquerque, particularly for the annual state fair and the International Balloon Fiesta, events held near the general area where some of the victims were known to frequent or disappeared. Acting on undisclosed information, investigators searched Irwin's home and business properties in Joplin, confiscating tens of thousands of photographs. He was initially identified as a person of interest. However, after investigation, which reportedly included Irwin voluntarily traveling to meet with the FBI and taking a polygraph test, APD explicitly cleared him as a suspect in the West Mesa murders. Investigators also looked into other individuals. Fred Reynolds, described as a local pimp who knew several of the victims, attracted attention for contacting victims' families after their disappearances. However, he died about a month before the remains were discovered, preventing direct questioning, and families reportedly did not believe he was involved. Scott Lee Kimball, a convicted serial killer from Colorado, claimed investigators looked into him in the West Mesa case, but he denied involvement. Additionally, an anonymous tip reported to both APD and the FBI suggested a possible link to a suspect from El Salvador, tying into the alternative theory of a trafficking ring. The lack of arrests stems primarily from the absence of definitive forensic evidence linking any single suspect to all the victims or the burial type itself. The death of the prime suspect, Montoya, removed the possibility of prosecution for him, and while the evidence against Bley remained circumstantial. The significant time delay and resulting evidence degradation created insurmountable challenges for building a prosecutable case based solely on the crime scene findings. There are two main theories that have dominated the investigation and the public discourse. The first is a lone serial killer, the West Mesa Bone Collector. This is the initial and most persistent theory, largely based on the discovery of multiple victims buried in the same general location, suggesting a single actor returning to a preferred disposal site. The profile emerging from this theory points to a perpetrator, likely male, who specifically targeted vulnerable women. Investigators suggested this individual is likely charming or friendly enough to gain the trust of these streetwise women and possessed intimate knowledge of the remote West Mesa burial area, allowing for repeated use without detection. Lorenzo Montoya, due to his proximity, history, statements, and the timing of his death relative to the cessation of the murders, fits many aspects of this profile. An alternate, or perhaps overlapping theory, involves the murderers being connected to a sex trafficking operation. Police and the FBI considered the possibility that the women were targeted by a ring, potentially operating out of Texas, and exploiting events like the New Mexico State Fair to procure and control victims. This theory implies the involvement of multiple individuals rather than a lone actor. Some general academic commentary on similar femicides along the border region also points to potential links with drug trafficking or other forms of organized crime. This trafficking theory introduces significant complexity, shifting the focus from profiling a single offender to potentially unraveling a criminal network. While it could potentially explain the number of victims and the specific targeting of women in the sex trade, the available snippets offer less concrete circumstantial evidence supporting this theory compared to the evidence gathered against Montoya. Regardless of whether a lone killer or a group was responsible, the targeting of specific vulnerable demographic appears central. 10 of the 11 victims had their shared ties to drug use and prostitution. This suggests motives were related to accessibility and opportunity. Women involved in street-level sex work or struggling with addiction are often more accessible to predators and operate in environments with fewer witnesses. There's also reduced risk. Perpetrators may perceive these individuals as less likely to be reported missing immediately, or less likely to garner significant law enforcement attention or public concern, thus reducing the perceived risk of capture. Power, control, and gratification, or the serial killer. If a lone serial killer was involved, motives likely align with common patterns observed in serial homicide, such as exerting power and control over victims, fulfilling violent fantasies, or achieving sexual gratification. Also, under the sex trafficking theory, elimination or punishment could be a motive. This could be silencing potential witnesses, punishing perceived disobedience, or disposing of individuals deemed no longer useful or controllable. The consistent focus on victims involving drugs and prostitution represents a critical aspect of the investigation. Understanding this victimology is necessary for investigators to identify potential points of contact between victims and perpetrators. The public communication of this link often devolved into language that dehumanized the victims and subtly implied their lifestyles made them culpable. This highlights the difficult balance between legitimate investigative focus and the ethical imperative to treat all victims with respect, avoiding societal biases that devalue certain lives and potentially impede justice. The West Mesa case resonates with several common themes in the study of serial murder. Serial killers target marginalized victims. This case exemplifies the disturbing pattern where serial offenders prey on vulnerable or marginalized populations. The victims are often perceived by society and sometimes by law enforcement or the media as less dead, leading to delayed investigations, inadequate resources, and less public pressure for resolution. The West Mesa investigation faced hurdles common to many serial homicide cases: difficulties linking potentially related crimes occurring over time, a lack of witnesses, and significant challenges with recovering usable forensic evidence, particularly from outdoor burial sites exposed to the elements. The discovery of all 11 known victims in a single localized burial area suggests a degree of geographical consistency by the perpetrator or perpetrators. either in disposal method or preferred location. This contrasts with serial killers who scatter victims over wide areas. More than 15 years after the initial discovery, the West Mesa homicide investigation remains officially classified as active and unsolved by the Albuquerque Police Department. Authorities emphasize that the case has never been closed or designated as cold, signifying a continued, albeit challenging, commitment to finding answers. In February 2024, on the 15th anniversary of the discovery, APD Chief Harold Medina publicly reaffirmed the dedication. "We have put a tremendous amount of effort into solving this case over the last 15 years, and we will not stop in the search for the individuals responsible. This case has never been forgotten, and I too seek justice for all those impacted by those crimes." And that's a strong, comforting statement. Ongoing investigative activities include the continued documentation and vetting of tips received through the dedicated tip line. The 118th Street Task Force continues its work, which has included auditing past tips, reviewing other cold case homicides for potential similarities, and investigator Ida Lopez, who has been involved since the beginning, remains a public contact point for information related to the case. A substantial reward of up to $100,000 remains available for information that leads directly to an arrest and successful prosecution. The reward represents a collaborative effort between the APD, the FBI, the families of the victims, underscoring the collective desire for resolution. And that's a significant reward. A lot of times, these types of cases with marginalized victims don't usually have such a significant award attached to them. So that also shows you that there is a serious effort here to try to solve this case. As we discussed, the APD maintains the case is active, but the fact that there hasn't been any significant public breakthroughs raises questions about whether this case even is solved. The investigation is relying on new information emerging. A crucial tip, a confession, or the discovery of new evidence, perhaps related to other missing people, rather than breakthroughs stemming from the reanalysis of the existing, heavily degraded evidence from the primary crime scene. Unfortunately, it seems like it's unrealistic that this case will be solved unless something happens. Some sort of other bit of information happens that makes everything click together. And this isn't a movie, so those things aren't very likely. Community members, particularly victims' families and advocacy groups, mobilized to ensure that the women were not forgotten and to push for systemic change. A significant outcome of these efforts was the creation of the West Mesa Women's Memorial Park, which was dedicated in June 2020 directly on the site where the remains were unearthed. The park serves as a permanent place of remembrance, featuring the names of the 11 women and an engraved stone honoring Michelle Valdez's unborn child. The transformation of a site of horrific violence into a space for grieving and honor represents a powerful symbolic act of reclaiming the narrative and centering the victims. However, it also physically alters the primary crime scene, potentially sealing off possibilities, however remote, of discovering minute, previously missed evidence fragments, thus representing both communal closure and a form of forensic finality. We discussed earlier how the initial law enforcement reaction was lackluster and possibly led to the ability for these crimes to continue to happen. The initial portrayal of the media coverage was similar, heavily emphasizing the victims' background, specifically their ties to drug use and prostitution. The framing quickly drew criticism from victims' families, community members, and advocacy groups. Critics argued that the relentless repetition of terms like prostitute and drug addict was disrespectful, dehumanizing, and bordered on blaming the victims for their own murders. Jessica Aranda of the Southwest Women's Law Center noted that this focus on lifestyle, rather than the investigation, fed into a cycle where the public failed to identify with the women members of the community, potentially leading to ambivalence about whether the crimes were solved. This pattern aligns with broader critiques of media portrayals of violence against marginalized women, particularly sex workers, where their lifestyles are often used implicitly or explicitly to diminish their worthiness as victims. In response to the criticism, some media reporting began to shift. Jeff Proctor, who was then a crime reporter for the Albuquerque Journal, acknowledged the concerns and adjusted his language, opting for phrases like struggled with addiction and having lifestyles that included prostitution. Over time, particularly through the efforts of families and advocates sharing personal stories and memories, the narrative gradually incorporated more emphasis on the victims as loved individuals, mothers, daughters, cousins. The narrative arc followed the case's progression. Initial shock and focus on the grisly discovery and scale, followed by reporting on the identification process, investigative steps, and the emergence of key persons of interest like Montoya, leading to coverage on anniversaries often highlighting the lack of resolution and the family's continued pain. The West Mesa Bone Collector moniker became a common shorthand in media reports. Later narratives increasingly included the community advocacy efforts and the establishment of the memorial park. The West Mesa murders remain one of Albuquerque's most haunting and unresolved tragedies. The discovery of 11 women and an unborn child buried in a desolate landscape in 2009 unveiled a horrific crime spree that likely occurred years earlier. The victims, primarily young Hispanic women grappling with addiction and involved in sex work, represented a vulnerable segment of the community, and their disappearances were largely unnoticed until the grim discovery forced citywide attention. The legacy of the West Mesa Bone Collector case is a reminder of the extreme dangers faced by marginalized women and the complex challenges inherent in investigating cold cases, particularly when compounded by degraded evidence and societal biases. It's important to remember that these were women that were lost, who were mothers, children, loved ones, and their legacy should be remembered as such. The West Mesa murders is a deep wound across Albuquerque and a deep wound against our society for how we treat victims, dehumanizing them rather than seeing the tragedy for their lives lost. Make sure you're subscribed to my channel, The Spooky Lawyer. Make sure that you are following me on Blue Sky and TikTok. My username is AKBruise. Go ahead and follow me on Twitter. My username is AKBruise there as well. If there is a spooky or disturbing story you would like me to cover, send me an email. My email address is thespookylawyer@gmail.com. There is a super thanks button in the YouTube toolbar. You can click that and make a donation to the channel if you would like. I would like to thank both AOTDK and Suze D for their donations to this channel. It was very kind of you, very generous of you to make those donations. I hope I'm pronouncing both of your usernames correctly. Any donations to this channel will be used to make better content, better videos for you guys. You also support me by continuing to watch my videos. It means a lot to me that you watch my videos. It really, truly does. And please make sure that you stay spooky.